This is The Guardian.
Hello and welcome to The Guardian Football Weekly, a performance that merits one of those and hows. PSG win the Champions League and how. A 5-0 demolition of Inter Milan. They were dominant from start to finish. Men against boys, except this time the boys were all really fast and brilliant and the men looked like old and haggard and ready to join the Vets League. Desiree Doué scored twice and set up one, 19 years old. Ousmane Dembele had another fine game. Kvaratskhelia, the midfield, the fullbacks, let's face it, the whole 11 were brilliant. A truly stunning achievement from Luis Enrique, whose dignity in the face of personal tragedy is truly breathtaking. And yet this is not just a fairy story, it's the completion of Qatar's sports washing project that began in 2011. And it was also a night that ended in tragedy and violence across France, with 2 people losing their lives. What of the opposition? Inter were there, but they weren't there. Even the ref felt sorry for them. 0 seconds of injury time. A season which promised so much a month ago, but ends with nothing. Also today, we'll congratulate Olden for winning the National League playoffs. There's Ancelotti to Brazil, some transfers, some Wilson stuff about Argentina, and perhaps the greatest parallel park in world history. All that plus your questions, and that's today's Guardian Football Weekly. On the panel today, Barry Glendenning, welcome.
Hello, Max.
Hello, Jonathan Wilson.
Morning, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. And good morning to Nicky Bandini.
Morning.
Alan says, best performance from a team in a final? PSG were going to win a Champions League eventually, and I'm happy it's this one, says Alan. Yes, PSG 5, Inter 0, their first European trophy, the biggest ever winning margin in a European Cup final. And it feels, Wilson, like Luis Enrique has built like the most perfectly balanced football team, like the roundest of pegs in the roundest of holes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, from a football point of view, they're brilliant. They're great to watch. Defensively, are there slight question marks possibly, but not an issue at all on Saturday. Was it the best ever performance by a team in the final? I think it's certainly the most one-sided European Cup final I'm aware of. I mean, 4 times the margin's been 4 goals. So Real Madrid beating Eintracht Frankfurt 7-3 in 1960. Frankfurt did get 3. They did take the lead. I mean, I know that 2 of their goals were quite late and this is sort of mad sort of splurge goals after the 70th minute. But yeah, it was clearly competitive for a while, that game. The 4-0s, Milan beating Barca in 94 was a sort of tactical triumph rather than one team just being better than the other. And in that game, I mean, certainly at 2-0, maybe even at 3-0, there was a thought that Barca could click back into this. When Bayern beat Atletico in 74, that was a replay. So obviously, it has been tight, at least in the first game. And so the only one I think you could say is remotely comparable was when Milan beat Steaua 4-0 in 89, which Arrigo Sacchi said it's the only time he's ever gone to bed after a game and thought that was perfect. So maybe that one's very hard to contextualise that at this remove. But it was sort of in a WhatsApp group, we were talking after sort of 20 minutes, what's the most one-sided final we remember? And we were sort of saying Barca Manchester United in 2011. But even then, United were able to cling on. They got the equaliser. I mean, it was completely sort of against the run of play equaliser, but they did have that punch. Whereas Inter really never looked like, I mean, until the very final minutes when the game lost all shape, they never looked like hurting PSG. So yeah, an absolutely magnificent performance. And I would imagine if you were there writing on it live, a very easy game to write about because it was done after 20 minutes.
I mean, I don't know if I am disappointed to not be in the genuinely talking about football WhatsApp group that you're in, Wilson. I'm looking at Barry. I'm sure he's not in it either.
Trust me, you wouldn't fit.
I don't think that's all they talk about.
Look, if it was someone's game, Barry, it was Desiree Doué. I mean, there were so many great performances, and I guess it might be Luis Enrique's game as well, but he was so good, and like, there was some talk about whether it's him or Barcola who starts, but what a performance from him!
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree it was his final. He scored 2 goals, he provided an assist, but there were so many other good performances. I thought Ousmane Dembele was brilliant, even though he didn't get in the score sheet. Vitinha was brilliant. Kvaratskhelia was brilliant. Every single PSG player played well, maybe apart from Donnarumma, and the only reason he didn't play well is because he didn't have to do much. I think he was called upon to make one good save, and he made it. It wasn't a particularly Difficult save, and the match was long over by that stage. But he won't have many easier nights at the office. I think it was as near to as perfect the execution of a game plan by a team I've ever seen. And while Inter were dismal, I think even if Inter had played well, they'd still have lost, because I don't think anyone was beating PSG that night. But yes, Doué was superb. The early goal, obviously, he set up the first goal. That was a brilliant move. Some appalling defending from Inter, and then scored the 2 goals. And when he was taken off, there was mutterings from the commentary team that, this is a real shame. He should be allowed to stay on the field to try and complete his hat-trick. But I think that would fly in the face of everything this PSG team is about, because it is very much the collective. It's not about individuals.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was superb, but they were all superb.
Yeah, and he didn't actually look that fussed when he was jogging off. I can have a sit down now. It's interesting, Nicky. Luis Enrique kept bringing up Ousmane Dembele and said something like afterwards, like he'd given the Ballon d'Or just for his pressing and his defensive work. Perhaps, I don't know why, perhaps that's the achievement Enrique is most proud of turning Dembele into this like complete footballer.
Yeah, I suppose like when we think about Dembele, he had this reputation, didn't he, as a younger player? I think especially after that move to Barcelona, where more than 100 million euros spent on him, and this expectation that he was going to be, I guess, something more like what we've seen this season. He was going to be that level of talent, and when it wasn't quite happening for him for various reasons, he wasn't. Maybe still isn't a great finisher despite scoring an outrageous number of goals this season. But there was people, I think, looking for reasons, were clinging very much onto stories like, the Barcelona doctor going up to see him because he was having some stomach issues, and finding him in the room with basically a bunch of young lads playing PlayStation with chips on the floor and generally looking like a bunch of teenage boys that haven't grown up, even though they might be in their 20s at that point. I think that was sort of this idea of him as being this kind of, not like the old-fashioned out in nightclubs kind of reckless, but this kind of maybe more modern version of what we perceive.
The Haribo reckless.
Yeah, like that sort of idea of it. And I think he's very clearly had a growing up this season at Paris Saint-Germain. And I think he was already doing that a bit at the end towards Barcelona. I think it's too black and white to say this just happened overnight under Luis Enrique. I think his final chapter at Barcelona was actually much more positive, and they weren't particularly keen to let him go when he left. So it isn't as simple as just saying, and Luis Enrique showed up and clicked his fingers and changed everything. But without question, that moment when Enrique drops him earlier this season has had, you can really separate his season to before and after, and it certainly from the outside looks like there's been an impact of the management there. But just to view that more broadly as well, when Jonathan was saying at the start about definitely the most one-sided final, but was it necessarily the best final performance? I think that's going to be subjective, obviously, for everyone. But I think that the case you could make for it is that even at 4-0, even when Inter had long ago run up the white flag and were just trying to get off that football pitch, you had Kvaratskhelia tracking back like an absolute madman, like absolutely charging players down. And I think we always talk in football, don't we, about this idea that you can only beat the team in front of you. PSG didn't stop only beating the team in front of them until the 90th minute, until the referee finally said, like you said, Max, no
They're
injury time.
Yeah,
exactly. But PSG were absolutely, and I think Dembele was that wholehearted commitment for the team, but so was everyone. Like the whole team just was not going to stop until the final whistle. And I think that is one of the reasons why I would say absolutely one of the most impressive performances I've ever seen in a final, because it was 90 minutes like that.
Yeah, and that midfield, and Barry touched on it, Wilson, is so good. The little pass from Vitinha, the opening goal looked like a training ground goal. Like it was, and I know, DiMarco was out of position and played him onside, but I just wonder with that 3, and I can't remember if I said this on a pod or somewhere else, but like, is it ridiculous to compare them to Xavi, Iniesta and Busquets? Not necessarily like for like, and they clearly have to go and repeat it if this team stays together. But just as a kind of perfect 3 who complement each other in such a way.
I mean, I know what you're saying, and I guess, yes. The problem is that they just don't have to do it very regularly, because the French league is so one-sided that it's easier to look incredibly energetic. I mean, look, it can go both ways. We've seen teams before who get sort of flabby and complacent because they're not being tested week in, week out. And the fact that PSG have been able to rest players for the last, I don't know how long, months, 6 weeks. And that's one of those things that's always sort of judged after the fact. If they rest players and they then play well, okay, they've done the right thing. If they're somehow just off it, then you need to keep them playing to keep them sharp. So it's very hard to judge that. But no, they're a great three. And I think João Neves, I think the thing I like most about him is he looks really like a young Anthony Perkins from Psycho. You look very blank there.
Yeah, well, I was waiting for Hopkins, and I was thinking he doesn't look like Anthony Hopkins, and that's where my brain had gone. Let me just look at Anthony Perkins.
So if he's got a sort of a deep interest in taxidermy, I think people should be very, very nervous going to his hotel.
Right. That's a good point. He does look like him. I mean, I don't know who else to mention, Barry. Like you mentioned Marquinhos, the one constant there. The fullbacks are so good. Pacho alongside Marquinhos. The players that come on, Barcola, the way he put Acerbi on the floor before putting that shot wide was just something else. And Mayulu looked, as producer Joel says, he looks like I would if I scored in a Champions League final. Just like couldn't believe it. So the question about all of these guys is like the fact that Enrique has built this team and they are so young and at the sort of expense of real Galacticos, even though they've been very expensively put together, is do you envisage eras of domination or an era of domination?
I suppose you have to remember that PSG sort of scraped into the knockout stages and then they struggled against Liverpool at times. I mean, I think nearly their other most complete performance in this competition was the match they lost against Liverpool 1-0.
Yeah, they were great.
They did everything but score 5 or 6 goals. There was a period against Villa when they looked like they might be in trouble. Was there one other game? Who did they beat in the
Arsenal
semi-final?
No, Arsenal was very comfortable, wasn't it? I thought.
Yeah, Arsenal was comfortable. But certainly, yeah. So they scraped into the quarterfinals. Didn't have it all their own way against Liverpool. Certainly didn't have it all their own way against Villa. It's the nature of knockout football that sometimes the better team will get beaten. Not always over 2 legs, but it happens. So I don't foresee them going on to win this every year for the next 7 or 8 years. But there will certainly be more of a force to be reckoned with than they used to be, I think.
Pick up on that and say, even the game against Arsenal, not for a second pretending that Arsenal were on a par with PSG because they weren't, but at the start of that second leg, PSG could have conceded a goal, right? At 1-0 up in the tie, Donnarumma makes some great saves, and we will talk about that. And then PSG go on to score and play great. But I think the margins, it's easy to forget after this final, but the margins in European football are generally quite tight. And it's really hard to put it all together because I always have talked about this, and I think maybe it's even more true now that we have this 8-round group stage, and then for some teams the playoff game as well. Champions League football has never been just about who's the best team. It's about who's the best team in the spring, right? You have to get to the spring. You can't mess it up in the group stage and not get there. But it is about who's the best team at the right point in the season. Because, again, I think, ridiculous as it sounds, you could still make a case that in the tournament as a whole, Inter were the best team, right? Because they played the group stage much better than PSG. Clearly, they are not anywhere near as good as PSG on the night. There's no case to be made. I don't think that you could have played that final 10 more times and you wouldn't have had a different outcome because it was a non-match. But PSG weren't good in the groups. They were just good enough to get out of it. And I think that the margins is one thing, the timing is one thing. But having said that, to me, looking at this team, I do look at this team and think, this is absolutely the favourite next year. I think there's no one else who I can put as close to them. Maybe Liverpool if they carry on the direction they're going. But this Inter team, again, were really good in this tournament. It's going to be forgotten that Inter were really good in this tournament. They were really, really good in this tournament. And they beat Barcelona and they beat Bayern Munich and they did a lot right. And then in this final, they looked like a completely lower level altogether. Like they weren't supposed to be part of the same conversation as a team as PSG. And I think that when you see, to go back to Doué, who Jonathan was talking about at the start, like when you see someone like that having this, not that he hadn't been great in this tournament already, but this to me, what felt like a coming of age moment on the big stage, where he's not just scoring 2 goals and getting an assist. He's acting like, oh, but I own this place, right? Doing that roulette around Bastoni, who, by the way, also a really good defender, but making him not look like one, which again, you could say he's done it all through the tournament. I'm sure he did one. Can't remember who it was against, maybe Akakpo against Liverpool as well. Seeing those players behave on this stage like, yeah, we're not at all fussed that we're in a Champions League final, it's where we're supposed to be. That's what makes me think we'll see them again and again in the latter stages of these tournaments. And it's, to bring it back to the elephant in the room, it's what makes these, I suppose, this occasion feel quite conflicting, because there is no romance in Oil Club wins another European trophy. We knew it was going to happen sooner or later, but it is, in terms of the players in it, quite a compelling, interesting team, which perhaps they haven't always been. That's what's going to be, I think, forever the oddness, the difficulty of covering these stories in the modern era, is there is no beauty left in the top levels of European football in terms of who owns these clubs and who's running these clubs. It's not like there's some great pure examples out there at the leading edge of European football. But there are still compelling stories within that. And yeah, seeing Doué have that moment on a big stage is still, I think, quite thrilling.
Yeah, and so on the beauty of it, like that Tifo Wilson that was unfurled at the end of the game with Luis Enrique and his daughter, who sadly passed away, and the way he has spoken about it so openly. I mean, there is just so much goodwill for Luis Enrique when we try and split apart the bits that are conflicting and aren't. Not just him as a coach and what he's achieved, but just on a human level, like that outpouring of love has been something to see.
Yeah, I mean, his tragedy in the way that he's dealt with that, the way he's spoken about that. You know, it is. I mean, there's no real way of saying this without sounding trite, but it's sort of it's a great human story, and you can't but feel for him, and you can't but sort of be grateful that the universe has given him this after the terrible times. That's completely true. Just on that other point about whether PSG can sort of build a dynasty here, I think a lot depends on whether those younger players, I mean, even people like Kvaratskhelia, how long do they want to stay there? You know, are they happy sort of plodding along, winning the French league without sort of breaking sweat? And if you think that the French league was one-sided this season, wait till next season when the DAZN collapse kicks in and everybody's having a fire sale apart from PSG. I mean, A, do they lose their edge because they will have even less challenge at home? B, do they think, actually, I want a proper test, and they either decide to move to Real Madrid, Barcelona, or possibly the Premier League? Yeah, that's, I don't know. If you're Doué, I mean, no reason for him to think about it now. No reason for him to think about it in another 3, 4, 5 years. But at some point, does he think, you know what, scoring a hat-trick against FC Patisserie every week isn't actually doing it for me? Obviously, they'd be playing FC Boulangerie and then Boucherie. They wouldn't just be Patisserie every week. It's like the Argentinian league where the structure is mad.
I understand that. The Ligue 1 ultras yelling, yeah, but look who PSG beat on their way to the final. But an interesting question then, I guess, Barry, about, is the challenge for Enrique, he's built this team of non-Galacticos, which is probably not the most accurate way of describing them, but and he's shipped off or they left. Lots of questions about Mbappe and how we view Mbappe now. He's gone and they've won. Is actually the skill for Enrique is to keep these players still tracking back, right? That's the key. Like how many Champions Leagues do you win before you go, I don't want to be tracking back in the 90th minute when we're 4-0 up.
Yeah, they're young footballers who've done well, so there is a chance they lose the run of themselves as far as ego is concerned. But Luis Enrique runs a very tight ship, and I would imagine anyone who shows any signs of getting too big for the boots will be slapped down immediately, and if they don't adjust their ways, they'll be shipped out and replaced. So I can't see that being an issue for Enrique. On the whole Qatari thing, I mean, Luis Enrique is such a likeable guy, and this is such a nice team to watch, but it does... You can't ignore the fact that it's been massively expensively assembled, and it is a sports washing project. And it's one that is working because
Yeah.
sports washing works.
Well, and the real point about that is that any club that's funded in a more traditional way, if they'd wasted the money that they have on Neymar, Mbappe, Messi, then they would not be in this position. But because they have a non-traditional means of financing, they still have all the money in the world to go out and hoover up the best young talent from France.
Yeah, Mike says 700 million euros in transfers in 2 years, a 658 million wage bill, win stuff. Who knew? GT saying, is it okay not to hate the fact PSG won this? Their starting 11 cost 403 million to assemble pounds compared to 137 million for Inter. Kvaratskhelia cost them 60 million in January. You know, Nasser El Khelaifi was celebrating with Sheffirin sort of being thrown into the air by the players. And I agree with you, Nicky, about the conflict, right? Like, it's almost like I don't know what else to say about sports washing that we haven't said a million times, apart from it's important to say it when not everybody says it who is covering this. But beyond that, I don't know what else to say.
I mean, and listen, there's a nice picture in this final, almost a still frame you can take that says a big part of it, right? Because the first goal scorer is Achraf Hakimi, who is very possibly the best right back in the world, has been brilliant. He was at Inter and had a brilliant season at Inter, and they sold him for, I think, about a 50% profit on what they spent on him after one season, because he had one good season. They thought, right, got to cash in. And the positive story that's been told in Italy about this season for Inter after everything went wrong at the end of it is, but guess what? They're going to turn a profit for the first time after Inzaghi took charge. When he took over, the year he took over, they just posted losses of like 250 million euros. So Inter have been on this journey back towards actually trying to balance the books, and PSG just don't have to, right? They just don't have to care about that at all. I think that there is a difficulty because, listen, Inter were the club of Moratti and his oil money that he threw around, and of course, ultimately he got his treble as well. And I think that there isn't much purity at the top of European football anymore, as I was saying before. But no, it's still seeing just everyone, really, just all the people you don't want to see at the centre of that celebration. You're very happy when the camera's on Luis Enrique. You're very happy when the camera's on these young players and being reminded that football is still football. But I do ultimately also agree with that, as sports washing, unfortunately, works and is working right here.
I completely take the point about Moratti, and I'm sure lots of fans of smaller Italian clubs are sort of going, you've done this to us for years, like, grow up. But the difference is Moratti is not a state where workers' rights are abused. You know, he's not a state where same-sex relationships are criminalised. He's not a state where women have to obey male guardianship laws. He's not a state where freedom of expression is severely repressed. He's just a very rich man. And that is a qualitative difference. Also, look at the sponsorship revenue the PSG get, and large chunks come from Qatari Airways and the Qatari Tourism Authority. I mean, how hard do you think those negotiations were to pull off? You know, that's the difference. That's why a state is different to a rich man or venture capitalists. However unpleasant they may be, they're not as bad as a state and never will be.
Well said.
Yeah, a lot of people asking questions along the lines of this from Jamie. How many hamstrings will Mickey van der Ven pull chasing that front three around when Ange plays the suicide high lining at PSG in the Super Cup? Yeah, are Thomas Frank and Marco Silva thinking, look, I will take over. Can it be after August the 13th? But yes, the Super Cup between PSG and Tottenham, I think a lot of Spurs fans quite nervous about that. How deep will that bus have to be parked? Something to look forward to. After the game, there was a lot of violence, not just in Paris, across France. 2 people have died, hundreds have been arrested during the celebrations of PSG fans. France's Interior Ministry said 192 people were injured in the clashes in the early hours of Sunday. 559 people arrested, 491 of those in Paris. 22 police officers and 7 firefighters were injured. 1 police officer was put into an induced coma. 264 vehicles were set on fire. PSG condemned the violence, saying these isolated acts are contrary to the club's values, in no way represent the vast majority of our supporters. Emmanuel Macron said the clashes were unacceptable and unjustifiable. The French Interior Minister, Bruno Retailleau, on social media said true PSG supporters are enjoying their team's magnificent match. Meanwhile, barbarians have taken to the streets of Paris to commit crimes and provoke the police. It's unbearable that it's unthinkable to party without fearing the savagery of a minority of thugs who respect nothing. Philippe did on Blue Sky said, I do not think that the sickening violence unleashed by PSG fans during and after their team's Champions League win would be that miraculously airbrushed from most reporting if it were another club. The idea that what went on is somehow unrelated to PSG is one of the reasons why it happened. And I guess that tiny minority line is used too often, but it's very hard for us to speculate on how much, Baz, this is PSG hooliganisms and how many is other people taking advantage of the situation. We spoke to the Times Paris correspondent yesterday who seemed to think it was quite distant from PSG fans.
Yeah, that was my initial thought, that the football match was more of an excuse for violence than the cause of the violence. And I've tried to educate myself in the meantime, and I've found it difficult because either no one knows or everyone's very reluctant to say what the reason for this violence was and what actually prompted it.
Well, I think you also have to bear in mind that, and this is totally speculative, I realise that, but we have seen at repeated football matches in France that policing in France is abysmal. So to what extent that is an issue, we don't know yet. You would hope that any inquiry into it is proper and thorough in a way that eventually, I think, the investigation into the final between Real Madrid and Liverpool was, but it took a long time for the truth to come out there.
Yeah. All right. That'll do for part one. We'll do Inter in part two. Welcome to part two of the Guardian Football Weekly. Fraser, amongst others, asks, has anyone ever shat themselves so emphatically in public in Munich like Inter Milan just have? we knew it was coming. Liam saying that if the pod's reaction to the Champions League final is not an hour of in-depth discussion on why the ref blew the whistle exactly on 90 minutes with no injury time, like it was an under-12 game that had got out of hand, I'll be very, very disappointed. Look, I'm stealing from your column, Nicky, but you went through like all the Italian press and, you know, nightmare, humiliation, rout, the debacle. I mean, I thought it was interesting that line that Franco Vanni in La Repubblica said about Inter's season after all this promise. It was nothing in the most painful way possible, a kind of reverse perfection, what it was from Inter. I mean, it was just, you know, it was bleak for them, wasn't it? And look, we've touched on a lot of the reasons of why it's hard to compete with PSG, but even still, it was a tough old night.
Yeah, I mean, to give the brief synopsis for those who haven't heard it 100 times before, and sorry for everyone who has from me, but Inter, this is the culmination of them blowing absolutely everything this season. They lost the Supercoppa to Milan. They lost Coppa Italia. Again, they went out in the semi-final to Milan. Milan are not good, by the way, this season. Really not a good Milan team. Finished very much in mid-table. And then they were obviously in position to win the league, blew that against Napoli and blew it again on the penultimate weekend when they had a chance to go back top because Napoli drew with Parma, and all Inter needed to do was hold on to a 2-1 lead against Lazio, and then in the 90th minute they give away a penalty and draw that game and miss their chance to go back top again. To do all that, and then you've just got this final left, and this is the one chance to redeem yourselves and to not even show up. Yes, it was as horrible a way as this season could have ended, and it does create this very odd dynamic, I think, for not just thinking about this season, but thinking about the whole Simone Inzaghi chapter in charge, because we still don't know at time recording. We're recording on Monday. He's expected to meet with the ownership on Tuesday. He said that before the final. That's always been the line. He could end up leaving now, and if he does leave, then look, he would have won the league, would have won the Coppa Italia a couple of times. He's done things. He's taken them to 2 Champions League finals. But there is this feeling of somehow, was it actually as successful as it was meant to be? Because they also didn't win the league a couple of times when they were meant to. They did reach these 2 Champions League finals and not win them. It was interesting because I was doing Match of the Day with Nedim the other day, Nedim Manu, of course, friend of the pod. And we were talking about which of the 2 Champions League finals Inter end up regretting more, because he was talking about this as being like this massive feeling of regret after you beat Bayern Munich and beat Barcelona. And I was like, as a player, do you regret more this one where you just think, well, we didn't show up and we got walloped? Or do you regret now, with hindsight, that actually against City you could have won? Against City, they really could have scored a goal and gone to extra time and things could have happened. They were in that game. So I don't know which of them ends up being a more profound regret. But I do feel like, from having been very much, in my opinion, certainly, and I feel like he was finally getting the recognition from the rest of Europe, Inzaghi's stock being very much one of these managers who deserves recognition as one of the best working in Europe, deserves, if he decides to stay in Europe, to be considered for all the biggest jobs going. How does this change that? Does this now mean he's completely viewed differently because on the biggest stage he really completely got outdone by Luis Enrique and his team got embarrassed? I think it leaves scars that are going to follow him and his players now in their careers, and possibly even in some cases they're going to be those lingering scars for players in retirement, for some of these Inter players who are up now into their mid and late 30s in some cases, and the thoughts they'll have with them for the rest of their lives to some extent.
It's sort of fascinating that you'll be better off just losing a ding-dong semi-final in sort of heroic way, and then you sort of go down in like heroic failure as opposed to this. Jim says, if Acerbi was 37 years old before kickoff, how old is he now? I mean, the average age of Inter starting 11 in the Champions League this season, 30 years and 19 days. The oldest of all the teams. PSG's is 24 years and 262 days. So the biggest age gap between two teams in Champions League history. Wilson, do you think that feels like that does matter? Like when everyone is old. I mean, and that isn't quite right. I guess, Marquinhos isn't young and Dembele isn't young, but like that difference, like eventually, like the wear and tear of a season, it just looked like they were falling apart.
It certainly looked like that. I mean, there's no question which the knackered old men were and which the thrusting young pups were on Saturday. I guess the question then is, Barcelona have young players. Why was it not such a big difference then? I mean, the other thing I was thinking on Saturday was Barcelona must be looking at this thinking, if we just spent 10 minutes practicing defending corners, we'd have been there. Like, how did we lose to this lot? And that's something I can't quite get my head around. And it was a strange dynamic to those semi-finals. Certainly here, that I think even up to about an hour into the second leg, all the talk was Barcelona will win this eventually. Of course they will. They're just better. And then because they don't, you start thinking, maybe Inter are doing something kind of clever or better. And actually, I just think Barcelona's inability to defend set plays, their vulnerability to simple balls played in behind them, is just a bizarre abnegation of responsibility from Hansi Flick. I know that's not really the question you asked me, but this final puts lots of question marks next to Hansi Flick's career, as well as whatever it does to Inter.
Poor old Hansi Flick will be 90 and Acerbi will be 250, and they'll be like, that year that ruined the pair of us. I don't know if a lot's been made, Nick, of that age, how old this team is, because you sort of think Inzaghi, right? He's being offered 50 million euros net for 2 years, right? Which would test. Even it would test Philippe, surely, like in the Saudi league. So, I mean, I don't know. And if he goes, but even if he doesn't, like that squad needs so much of an overhaul.
Yeah, speaking just personally for a second, I think it'd be a massive shame to see Inzaghi at 49 years old take that step. I think if he's going to leave Inter, it would be much more interesting to see him go somewhere else in Europe and see if he can do some of the same things he's done, achieve the same successes. In my opinion, and I get the impression that Jonathan has a much lower opinion of Inter and Inzaghi than I do, but in my opinion, he's absolutely, notwithstanding this result, a brilliant manager who has done so much right at that club. And again, I think it's worth remembering they haven't been spending in the period he's been there. They have been cutting budgets the whole time, selling players, and let's not also forget he had a pretty impressive chapter at Lazio as well, winning the cup before there. I think he has shown he's got a lot going well for him. I think he definitely made some horrible mistakes in this game, and I think that it was really an underwhelming tactical performance and some very confusing substitutions, not making really any attempt to reshape his team in a more attacking way at 2-0 down. So you don't absolve him of the things that he gets wrong in this game, but I think certainly more positive than, again, it sounds like maybe Jonathan is on some of the things he's done before in this tournament.
You obviously see him way more than me, and I defer to your judgment in that regard. I basically see him in the Champions League. Yeah, clearly he got the semi-final right, and you have to give him credit for that. I like the way that he's been so flexible. That sometimes it's back three, sometimes it's back four. I like the fact that they could press in patches, drop deep in patches. I think that ability to switch between styles is great. but to just be so, not just to be outplayed on Saturday, but to be unable to check that in any way. And that's why I think that comparison with 2011 is telling. That, Alex Ferguson said that no team he'd ever managed had got a chasing like that, but he kept it to 3-1. They had it. Was it 1-1 at half time, or did Barca get the second just before half time? But they got it to 1-1 after sort of 35, 40 minutes. They're still in it, and sometimes that's all you can do. And I know it's difficult when the second goal goes in after 19 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it was. If you're really the best in the world, you have to be able to do something, and it just seemed like a complete capitulation. And I'd almost have respected him more if he just retreated to his bench and sat there with his head down till it all went away, rather than that weird sort of arms out like he's being crucified, but thrusting his groin at the same time, which he just kept doing over and over again, which just made him look a bit silly. So look, I absolutely defer to you. He's obviously a good coach. He obviously gets a lot right. He got a lot right in the semi-final. I'm just baffled by how unable he was to respond. How he didn't seem to predict those interactions in midfield, or didn't have a plan to counter that. Which I just don't get how you could. Maybe his players just weren't capable of it.
Yeah, I think you can't absolve the players, right? I mean, Dimarco is absolutely awful in this game, really awful.
Yeah, well, I'm now asking questions about Lamine Yamal. Is he actually any good? Did he just play against Dimarco?
His legacy as well, poor guy.
So you can't absolve players of responsibility, and I think there are some players for whom you feel like they were exposed, like. I have no defence to mount on some of the things that Dimarco did at the start of that game. Been playing everyone on side on the first goal. There was so much about him that was just off. Really, maybe some of it is tiredness, but really, really disappointing.
Johnny Liu was saying he was sitting behind an Italian journalist who's doing the ratings, and next to Barella after 80 odd minutes, he just said indolente. which seemed, I mean, you could pretty much say that of any of the midfield, I suspect.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, some of them it is just age, right? I think Acerbi, honestly, I've been thinking for despite that incredible goal against Barcelona, which is amazing, right? What a moment, and he'll still have that. Maybe at some point in his career, he'll be able to look back on that and think, even though we lost the final, that was pretty stinking cool that I scored a 92nd minute equaliser in a semi-final against Barcelona. But I think his defending this season has not been at the level it was when they went to the final 2 years ago. That just objectively, I think across the season, if you look at the games he's played, he hasn't. Whereas I think 2 years ago, he was really in this particular moment, almost at 35 years old, in some odd second peak. And I think when you watch the way he played against number 9s like Erling Haaland in that tournament was really impressive. Yeah, some of it is age, some of it is tiredness. I did wonder, not to absolve Inzaghi completely, because I agree with everything Jonathan just said. I think his failure to predict and his also failure to react were really, really disappointing. But I did wonder, while we always talk about, is it better to play in a competitive league and have the competitive games, or to have a league that is easy, where you just win those games but maybe you don't get the good practice? I think just the end of this season, the fact that PSG were basically done weeks ago, it felt like Enrique had come to this game with a plan that he'd been working on for weeks. It felt like he had really studied Inter and knew exactly which buttons to push. And it felt like Inter came there going, oh, we'll just do what we always do. And I think that was maybe could be influenced by the fact they had a competitive title race at the end.
Inzaghi was just in the WhatsApp group going, is anyone around? Anyone available for Saturday? I know people don't like the, find the comparisons between amateur football and this level ridiculous, but as a team that play, we are over 40s ostensibly, and we play in an all-age league, and sometimes we're playing against 25-year-olds who are really good. And it was Hume away last year, and it's rolling subs, and I think we were 4-0 down, so like the gaffer looks around to the bench to see who can bring on, and we'd all got changed. We were like, these guys can just finish this run. None of us can walk. It's all right. You're done. We were just there. Sorry, Wilson.
I was going to say quickly on that point specifically, there was a really fun conversation between Nedim and Thomas Hitzelsberger at the BBC that night, which was off air, and I just thought I'd share it. Hopefully they don't mind.
Sure.
Because they were saying that when you play as a professional footballer, when you're in training, they quite often do like old versus young, like the older half of the squad against the youngest half of the squad for the mini practice games. And Nedim was saying, and like normally the more experienced players win that, right? That more often than not they win. But he was saying, and Thomas was agreeing, like, but when we don't win, when the older players don't win, the more experienced ones, it tends to be an absolute walloping. It tends to be an absolute thrashing, because everyone just suddenly realises, God, we haven't got the energy to run with these guys.
I mean, in a sense, there's a comparison with the end of the 66-67 season for Inter. Because that season, I think they were 4 points clear with, I'm going to say, 7 games of the league to go, something like that. Then had the semi-finals of the European Cup where I think they played CSKA Sofia and then obviously Celtic in the final. But that CSKA Sofia game went to a replay, which they managed to get played in Bologna, I think, by giving away 3/4 of a gate receipt so they didn't have to travel. And they just fell away completely that season, lose to Celtic, and then Nicky will be able to remind me who they played on the final day. But it was the team who came from Serie D under the bloke who coached Italy at the '66 World Cup. And they lost, and I think if they'd drawn, they'd have won the title.
Padua.
Mantova.
That's it. That's right. That'll do for part 2, and we'll do any other business in part 3. Welcome to part 3 of the Guardian Football Weekly. Actually, just one more on the Champions League. Zach says, does PSG's victory emphasise how pointless 90% of the league phase was? Like, now we've had the whole competition, Barry. Is the new format good? Or I remember you saying you were looking forward to it just because it was different. Was it so long ago now you can't remember it?
No, I remember it. So what? We've had 189 games in this year's tournament. I can't remember every single one of them. But
it's a shame that Cherby played in all of them.
Look, the Champions League knockout stages are always brilliant. The group stage is hit and miss. There are some woeful mismatches. Some games end up being kind of meaningless or totally meaningless, but they can still be good. And 'twas ever thus, I suppose, since the Champions League format became a thing, when they switched from straight knockout. And I think the new group stage is fine. Okay, it's all right. Look, we've only had it for one season.
Yeah,
come back to me in 5 years.
They're not going to put that on they're not going to put that on the poster, though, are they? Is my yes, Wilson?
Well, the question I would have is that I saw a lot of Celtic fans particularly, but I guess other teams of that sort of level, who would say, "Oh, this is great because we're still in Europe after Christmas. We've got these playoffs," and they came remarkably close to beating Bayern. But they finished between 17th and 24th. Now, if they'd done that in the old group stage, they'd finished third in the group. They'd have been in the Europa League. If you're a Celtic fan, would you not fancy a crack at Tottenham to win that title? Is it better to go out in a playoff to a big team? Or is it better to have a chance of winning something? And so I think whatever the merits of the league stage, what it has done is make the Europa League weaker. And I'm not sure that's a good thing.
I don't know. I feel like the greatest team in the world won the Europa League this year. Jonathan, you've written a piece about Ancelotti becoming Brazil's head coach. First foreign manager to take charge of them.
Sole charge.
Sole charge. Yes, there was like a Uruguayan in the 30s or something.
There's a Uruguayan and I think he's called Joreca, a Portuguese bloke. Okay. The Portuguese bloke did 2 games as joint manager in friendlies against Uruguay in 1944. The Uruguayan was a joint manager in the 1925 Campeonato Sudamericano. But Ancelotti's the first sole manager. And you'll be excited to learn it's actually all about the Hungarian coffee houses.
Is that right? Are you not going to tell us what it is? We just, I'm happy to point it out, but could you?
When Brazil were great, and I think there's this myth about Brazil that in 1970 they were just sort of these samba geniuses who wandered off the beach, which is not true at all. They're one of the best prepared teams there's ever been. And that was true when they won it in 58. It was true when they won it in 62. The organisation went a bit awry in 66, but the organisation's brilliant again in 1970. Physically, they're incredibly well prepared, but tactically, they're ahead of the game. They invent the back four. They invent the 4-2-4 before 1958, and that's what gives them a huge tactical edge. The rest of the world tries to copy them in 62, by which time they've moved to 4-3-3. By 1970, although they're not pressing, they're playing a very modern-looking system where they've got sort of 4 number 10s and a wide forward, but they've got a shape that works. The interactions between them work. They play very compact. So it's not pressing, but there is sort of a zonal element to it. All of that puts them ahead of the rest of the world. They won those World Cups because they had brilliant players, because they were brilliant players who were very well prepared in a very good system. And if you look just before the 58 World Cup, a lot of the influence was Hungarian. You had Hungarian coaches going over from late 20s, a lot of them in the 30s. Dori Kushner, probably the most significant in 1936, who took the WM to Flamengo. His assistant, Flavio Costa, then takes that on. He sort of slightly tweaks the WM to make the Diagonal which you sort of, if you imagine the WM, you've got 3-2-2-3, you've got that square in the middle, you slightly tip it. So one of those players...
You had to ask him, Matt.
if you let me finish, Barry.
I'm so sorry, Barry. Can we still be friends?
The deep line, one of the midfielders drops deeper, becomes a second-time defender. One of the inside forwards goes slightly further forward, so you get the 4-2-4. Ancelotti comes absolutely from a Hungarian tradition. He has always said, although he's associated with Arrigo Sacchi particularly, Ancelotti has always said his great mentor was Niels Lidholm, the great Swedish inside forward, played in the wing as well, but great Swedish forward at Norrköping and then at Milan, and then a great coach in Italy, won the league with Milan, won the league with Roma, took Roma to that European Cup final in 1984. Lidholm's great mentor was Lajos Szesler, who taught him the game at Norrköping, and Szesler is absolutely of that Hungarian Jewish tradition, who fled or left Hungary in the 1930s. So by appointing Ancelotti, Brazil have returned to their roots, that actually this is more the tradition of Brazilian football than Dorival or people like that.
Do you want the bad news, Barry?
No, go on.
But there's a question about the Argentinian league title.
Apertura. Yes.
Here we go. Jessica says, can Jonathan Wilson comment on Platense's historic first ever Argentine league title on Sunday? Phenomenal achievement for a small underdog club from Saavedra in North Buenos Aires, beating giants Racing, River, San Lorenzo, all away games with no fans, 1 goal conceded on the route to the final against Huracan. I've done most of the work for you, Wilson.
Yeah, I mean, defensively excellent. The problem with Argentinian football is you always have to explain how the league works, and it's always much more complicated than it needs to be. So there's 2 groups of 15. You play everybody in your group once. You also then play two teams from the other group, one of whom is your designated rival. So everybody's given so River's designated rival obviously is Boca, Independiente is Racing, and so on. You will also then be drawn a random team from that group. So you play 16 games. The top 8 from each of these 15-team pools go through into the last 16. It's one-legged. Platense won 1-0 at Racing. They drew 1-1 at River and then won on penalties. They won 1-0 at San Lorenzo. And then in a final play, for some reason, in Santiago del Estero, which is, I think it's the 12th biggest city in Argentina. It's up in the north. They beat Huracan 1-0. Now, if Huracan had won, they haven't won the league since 1973, so that would have been a big story as well. But this is Platense's first triumph. They've been around for 120 years. Do you know what their colours are? Do you know what kit they wear?
Well, I do, you've told me, but surprising.
They wear brown. So I suspect...
Coventry away. It's a Coventry homage.
Yeah, so I mean, the reasons why they wear brown are lost in the mist of time, but there's 2 stories. So I think the less believable is they used to wear white, and because the kit would get mud stained, and apparently their home ground is very marshy, so there's a lot of mud there. One of the directors early on said, why don't we put brown patches on the kit and then that'll hide the mud stains? I think more plausible is they said, right, there's this horse race and whoever wins, we will wear the colours of that jockey, and the jockey wore brown and white. So that's why they wear brown and white. And they've also got joint managers. So their managers are Fabio Orsi and Sergio Gomez, who seem to have worked together for 12, 13 years. I don't know why they work together, but they always have. They come as a pair, and now they won the league. And if you want the slightly gloomier side of things, I think this probably shows just how weak the Argentinian Championship is at the minute. But it's obviously a great story for the Platense. And one of the great things about having two championships every season, having it being sort of very short form, having everybody having equal amounts of no money, is lots of different teams can win it. And so if you're a Platense fan, I suspect yesterday was one of the great nights of your life.
And interesting, those 2 joint managers, because they've been together so long, like Ant and Dec, they have to stand in the same order, otherwise it just doesn't work. Thank you, Wilson. I think that 10 minutes is why we all love you. It means we don't really have a lot of time for much else. Real Madrid have paid 10 million euros around to sign Trent Alexander-Arnold early from Liverpool in time for the Club World Cup. Probably wanted a holiday, didn't they? Chelsea look like they'll get Liam Delap. We can talk about that nearer the time, I guess. On the subject of Chelsea, an apology from me. I said on the last pod, the reason they had an opportunity to win the Conference League is because they finished 8th, and they actually finished 6th, and lots of pedants got in touch. But most pedants were like, I'm really sorry to be a pedant, but I'm being a pedant. So that's fair enough. But their league position is why they were in the Conference League. Liverpool confirmed the signing of Jeremy Frimpong, close to agreeing a deal for Kirkes from Bournemouth, Florian Wirtz as well. Seem like very sensible signings, don't they? All of them. We haven't really spoken, Nicky, to you about Napoli winning the title and, the Scott McTominay's year. It's just been so glorious, hasn't it?
Yeah, been an incredible year. And I feel guilty because I've talked a lot about Scott McTominay, and not without good reason, because he absolutely was the defining player of the season, as crazy as that sounds. He was a Serie A's most valuable player. He's got the award and deserves it, with not only the fact he scored, I think, was it 12 goals in total for Napoli, but I think 8 of them were the goals that broke a 0-0 deadlock as well, so scored important goals. But also Billy Gilmour on that team, who wasn't always a starter for them, wasn't as much a leader of the group as McTominay, but was really good in the final round and does absolutely deserve his winners' medal as well. So yes, the Scottish influence in Serie A only grows. Of course, Lewis Ferguson, brilliant Bologna last season, came back from his injury there as well. As all through the division, there's a few names now. So yes, great story with Napoli. I'm sure we don't have time to go into it in big detail, but I was just counting this morning, and I think this season, Napoli, Antonio Conte, there was a lot of suggestion he might leave after they won the title. He's now looking set. But even if he stays, there's a chance we could have as many as 8 new managers across the top 10 teams in Serie A.
Great.
Because Inter, we'll wait and see. I already said Inzaghi's meeting with the owners on Tuesday, but his certainly, at time of recording, it's not certain when Inzaghi stays at Inter, so there could be a vacancy there. Atalanta, well, Gasperini's already gone. After 9 years at Atalanta, he's gone to Roma. Juventus, we don't know yet. Igor Tudor is kind of on tenterhooks, waiting to find out. Really, poor Igor Tudor is waiting to find out if the owners think they can find someone better, because it seems like what's happening at the moment is they're having a good chat about whether or not they want to stick with him, but really it's about who's available to replace him. But not certain at the moment. Roma, who have, appointed Gasperini, or that'll be announced very shortly. Fiorentina, Palladino stood down. Lazio looks like Maurizio Sarri's coming back in to replace Marco Baroni. Milan, Max Allegri's back replacing Conceição. Bologna, finally we've got one where we get Italiano sticking. And then Como in 10th place is Cesc Fabregas. And the word is at the moment that if Inzaghi does go, Fabregas could be the number 1 candidate for the Inter job. So we could have as many as 8 changes to that top 10. There's a lot of speculation in there, but certainly we're getting a minimum of about 5 or 6. So lots of change.
Speculation is okay in the summer. I just think Creven Kelleher has agreed a deal to go to Brentford, which is quite interesting as well. We'll talk about that on another. We've got a Q&A tomorrow. We can do that.
Can I bring in one other thing that I just think is very Football Weekly?
Yeah.
So obviously Inter lose the Champions League final, Luis Enrique story. The signing that they've already announced this summer is Luis Enrique from Marseille, which I just thought is perfect. Lose the Champions League final and go out and sign someone who just sounds like the guy who beat you in the final.
In the National League playoff final, Olden beat Southend 3-2 after extra time. I don't know, Barry, if you've seen the highlights of this one, but it was a cracking old game.
I'm afraid I haven't. But I am a gentleman of a certain age who's old enough to remember Oldham in the Premier League. Andy Ritchie, Ian Marshall, Roger Joseph and the boys. So they've been through the ringer since they got relegated from that in 92. Yeah, it was the first season at the end. The end of the first Premier League season, and they've only suffered relegation since and had some dismal owners, so it's good to see them back. And Joe Royal's son, Joe Royal obviously managed them that time. His son is the CEO at Oldham now.
Okay. Didn't know that. Yeah, it was a ding-dong game. Southend were 1-0 up at half-time, 1-1 at full-time. Southend went 2-1 up. They had a great chance to go 3-1 up. Guy hit it straight at the keeper. And then Oldham scored twice. The winning goal, one of those crosses that just evades everybody and just sort of bounces, looking like harmlessly into the back of the net. But yeah, very well done to Oldham.
There's a crowd of, I think, just north of 50,000 at that game, which is a record for a non-league final. And it would have been higher but for travel shenanigans.
Yeah. Tom says sometimes you wait your whole life for one moment, but enough about Max's parking skills. People have seen it. And I've talked to you about it a lot, Barry, but I would say one of the greatest parallel parks of all time. And not much of my content on Instagram does well, but this has done really excellent numbers. People very excited about it. I was so excited that I was filming the last A-League show of the season, the grand final. Melbourne City, congratulations to them, beat Melbourne victory. And I parked about 50 yards from the door. I walked to the door and there was one of my co-hosts, Thomas Sorensen. And I was like, hey, Thomas, you've got to come. As I got out of the car, a girl who owned the car in front of mine, who was just coming out of her flat, said, that is a good park. And I was like, yeah, it is a good. Now you mention it, it is good. So I went up and at the door, Thomas Sorensen was there. I was like, how are you, Thomas? He was like, fine. I said, I've just done a great, come and have a look at this park. And he's like, he's not a man for hyperbole. So I took him down the road and he was like, actually, that is a great park. So then we walked to the front door to go in. And then our other co-host, Archie Thompson, who has got the world record for scoring the most number of games in an international fixture when Australia beat American Samoa, I think 36-0, but he scored 13 goals in that game. I said, Archie, you've got to come and see this park. We went down and we looked at the park and he was like, that is a good park. And that was when I filmed the bit of content. But yeah, delighted. And Barry and I got a 2-hour radio show out of people's favourite parks. It turns out people take photos. People are sending us photos from like 2006. This is when I parked the Fiat Punto in Portofino. This was the moment. Anyway, thank you, Tom, for getting in touch and letting me recount that anecdote again. Sure, I'll find another place to use it. Women's Football Weekly is back on Thursday this week, covering the Nations League. Also, do a bit more on that brilliant 6-0 victory over Portugal on Friday. And we have an end-of-season mailbag tomorrow, so we desperately need your questions. Me, Barry, Philippe, John Bruin. You can talk to us on Instagram, on Blue Sky, or on email, footballweekly@theguardian.com. And that'll do for today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Nicky.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wilson.
Cheers, thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thanks.
Football Weekly is produced by Joel Grove. Our executive producer is Danielle Stevens.
This is The Guardian.